Hello, world. Welcome back to another episode of Practicing Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. My name's Sarah, and I'm here with my friend Lizelle. And today we're going to be talking about episode 34, which is called Sacredness, Horror, Music, and the Symbol. And so, as I usually do, I'm going to pass it over to Lizelle to get us started with a quote.
Hello, world. Sarah, I need to beg your patience this morning. I want to read the myth of the cave, but I want to read the entire myth of the cave.
Ooh, I
It
like
is.
it a lot.
I I think it's appropriate in two ways. It fits this whole idea of horror,
Mm-hmm.
and it fits my life because this afternoon, over this evening, I have a lecture on the myth of the cave.
I also want to
So,
presence that it feels very right that we're kind of coming out of winter into
oh
spring. And
yes,
it's kind
yes.
of that energy here. At least we're getting like pastels for the soft pastels for the flowers, a lot of blossoms on apple trees and magnolia, pink magnolia, and azaleas are blooming. So there's a lot of pinks and nice pastels. So yeah, it feels right for me too. I'm happy to listen.
Okay, thank you. Then next, I said, make an image of our nature in its education and want of education, likening it to a condition of the following kind. See human beings as though they were in an underground, cave like dwelling, with its entrance, a long one, open to the light across the whole width of the cave. They are in it from childhood, with their legs and necks in bonds, so that they are fixed, seeing only in front of them, unable, because of the bond, to turn their heads all the way around. Their light is from a fire burning far above and behind them. Between the fire and the prisoners, there is a road above, along which we see a wall, built like the partition puppet handlers set in front of the human beings, and over which they show the puppets. Then also see along this wall human beings carrying all sorts of artifacts, which project above the wall, and statues of men and other animals wrought from stone, wood, and every kind of material, as it as is to be expected. Some of the carriers utter sounds, while others are silent. It is a strange image, and strange prisoners you're telling us of, Socrates. They're like us, Socrates said. For in the first place, do you suppose such men would have seen anything of themselves and one another other than the shadows cast by the fire on the side of the cave facing them? How could they, he said, if they have been compelled to keep their heads motionless throughout life? And what about the things that are carried by? Isn't it the same with them? Of course. If they were able to discuss things with one another, don't you believe they would hold that they are naming these things going by before them that they see? Necessarily. And what if the prison also had an echo from the side facing them? Whenever one of the men passing by happens to utter a sound, do you suppose they would believe that anything other than the passing shadow was uttering the sound? No, by Zeus, he said, I don't. Then most certainly, I said, Socrates said, such men would hold that the truth is nothing other than the shadow of artificial things. Most necessarily, his interlocutor said. Now consider, Socrates said, what their release and healing from bonds and folly would be like if something of this sort were by nature to happen to them. Take a man who is released and suddenly compelled to stand up, to turn his neck around, to walk and look up towards the light, and who, moreover, in doing all this, is in pain, and, because he is dazzled, is unable to make out those things whose shadows he saw before. What do you suppose he'd say if someone were to tell him that before he saw silly nothings, while now, because he is somewhat nearer to what is and more turned towards being, he sees more correctly, and in particular, showing him each of the things that pass by, were to compel the man to answer his question about what they are? Don't you suppose he'd be at a loss and believe that what was seen before is truer than what is now shown? Yes, his interlocutor said, by far. And, Socrates continues, if he compelled him to look at the light itself, would his eyes hurt? And would he flee, turning away to those things that he is able to make out and hold them to be really clearer than what is being shown? So he would. And if, Socrates continued, someone dragged him away from there by force along the rough, steep, upward way and didn't let him go before he had dragged him out into the light of the sun, wouldn't he be distressed and annoyed at being so dragged? And when he came to the light, wouldn't he have his eyes full of its beam and be unable to see even one of the things now said to be true? No, he wouldn't, he said, at least not right away. Then I suppose he'd have to get accustomed if he were going to see what's up above. At first he'd most easily make out the shadows, and after that the phantoms of the human beings and the other things in water, and later the things themselves. And from there he could turn to beholding the things in heaven and heaven itself, more easily at night, looking at the light of the stars and the moon, than by day, looking at the sun and sunlight. Of course. Then finally, I suppose he would be able to make out the sun, not its appearance in water or some alien place, but the sun itself, by itself, in its own region, and see what it's like. The myth continues. The philosopher is supposed to go back into the cave, but will stay with the sun for a while.
Okay. I like that, to stay with the sun and to also prolong the story. Because, yeah, that's like really special to sit with, that realization that coming out of the cave means experiencing the warmth of the sun, the light of the sun, and the actual, I don't know, like what, I don't even know how to describe it, sacredness.
But the horror associated with experiencing it at first, being dragged, being tormented by thinking, oh my word, I'm seeing illusions now. What I saw was real. What I'm seeing now, it can't be real, can it?
Especially when everybody's telling you that what you saw was not real and what they have seen their whole life and what you saw your whole life was real. Yeah. Okay. I love that. That myth is so great. And of course, like always comes to mind the Matrix too when you think of that arc, because that's based on that. So anyway, that was also what I was imagining for this era. Okay, so that's a beautiful way to bring us into this particular episode because yes, we're talking about horror at first, and then we'll move into music and symbols. But as John always does, we'll start with kind of a little bit of a recap of last episode. And do you want to take us through just what you got that will lead us in, or I can do that?
Well, I did not write a lot of the recap. I basically wrote sacredness and not the sacred, which is important
Yep.
distinguishment to make. Same as relevance realization and not relevance. And then I wrote meta meaning system. I jumped a lot. That affords worldview attunement and thereby homes us against horror. What he talked about
Yep.
last time. But now he's picking up again the idea of the numinous, and that's where my notes start. So I think there's a lot of the intro that I did not write down again, but
Well, I got pretty much what you got. I do want to presence that nice word religio because he
mhm.
mentions that, and how that covers all aspects of spirituality explained by relevance realization.
And
Might
then
not be
he
okay. What? What?
he gestures like on that side of the board, but he has nothing on the board yet still. But I do still have
Yay!
everything on the
It's
board.
still there.
That
It's on the
side of the
right
board.
side.
Whoops.
Well, you're left, but all right. Because he says he's like recapping that side. That's what that
Yeah,
whole episode
yeah,
was about. So
yeah.
in this recap, he's going back over that whole side of the central features of human spirituality. And then he mentions this word religio because it's nice and succinct for that, covering all aspects of the spirituality explained by relevance realization. And then he said, but something's still missing, which was what you were talking about, the sacred, and distinguishing between the sacred and sacredness. Sacredness is the experience. And that's what you were saying functions as a meta meaning that affords worldview attunement that homes us against horror.
Mhm.
And I remember really liking that from last time too, like homing us from
Yeah.
horror. So I'm excited to get into this one. Um, he did mention a little bit about Stoicism and just like syncretic religions, but I don't think that's really important. So,
He's just referring back with that to what he's when he talked about the original Greek domicile. That was their
mhm.
responses. Plus,
Yeah,
then the
okay.
Gnostic. Talking of the Matrix. The Matrix is also a type of Gnostic
Yeah.
response to what the fuck is going on.
In the new age.
Or actually, listening to Johannes's lecture this morning again, I have to say, the question is not what the fuck is going on, but what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
That is the real question. What is
Thisness.
this? Yeah.
Glad you coined that word.
Oh, yes.
Now we have use for it. The thisness. Okay. I do want to also say that that thing that you said about numinous, like auto, the experience of the numinous as opposed to the idea of the holy. He's saying another aspect of sacredness is that before there was a moral view of the sacredness, there was a pre-moral view of the sacredness, which was what Otto was encapsulating in that kind of glorious image of God, where it's not morally anything, it's just shiny and like, wow, overwhelming. Okay, so he was talking about the book of Job and how Job has all of these like moral arguments of his suffering, and God's response to all of that is, I'm so glorious. I don't think that's like I know that there's probably, well, please. Is that a good, is that a fair synopsis if you wanted to put it in a sentence?
Unfortunately, yes.
Amazing. Good. Okay. Well,
Like, why are you punishing me although I don't deserve it? Like, look at me, I'm pretty. Like,
the sacred is just like, I'm so pretty.
well, it was more powerful because he speaks of the lithiath. I don't know how to pronounce this in English. The the monster of the deep and all kinds of animals and how he made them and their taming is and how his power more than prettiness is like really what he's
Yeah.
pointing to there. It's like how can you question someone who was who created the waters that is full of untamed beings? It's like who are you?
Hmm.
That's more the whole.
Very good question. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, it reminds me of, I think I've referenced this one too, Arjuna on the battlefield, where
yeah,
he's asking God, like, well, I want to see all of you. And God shows the very terrifying and horrifying parts.
yeah,
And then Arjuna's like, no, no, never mind. I don't want to see that anymore. And it all is because there's something like very, actually, it's a moral question of Arjuna entering the battlefield. He's
yeah,
like, I don't want to go kill
yeah,
people.
mm,
And God's like, well, here's many forms.
yeah,
And yeah, just to display like all the
yeah.
experiences. And yeah, so it's kind of parallel, I think, a
Yeah,
parallel
it
story.
does sound, this sounds something similar to that indeed.
Um,
Although uh, Job was suffering unfairly
mm,
in his view, and that's why he was like questioning God, and not that he had to inflict pain or suffering on others.
right.
That's like a kind of difference there.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Mm.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Takes us into the heart of horror. So I think
Mm,
that's just beautiful. And I don't think he said it exactly like that, but sometimes he starts a sentence and then he stops and then he says something else. And
yeah,
I think that's what I kind of got from two sentences of him, that
nice.
it takes us into the heart of horror.
Yeah, that's really nice. That's a nice way to say it. He's mentioning the opposite, which is Gertzian. Is that something very important? All I have is bordering on horror, but he had mentioned Gertz before with the
Yeah.
domicide.
Yeah. So I think like probably I'm not sure if he's referring to this Gert, but it's very, very possible. He's from episode 7, this book recommendation. I think maybe I'm jumping ahead, but maybe I'm stepping back. So Otto has this phrase when he talks of the sacred or the numinous. I'm going to read the Latin because that's how I learned it, because I always get it a bit wrong. Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. So you hear all the words in there, right? Mysterium, the
Mm-hmm.
mystery,
Mm-hmm.
tremendum, and that's why I said it's actually terror, but he's going to go with horror. But tremendum, in that I hear that fear and trembling, which
Yeah.
Kierkegaard gets from a quote from the Bible, actually. Et fascinans, that fascination. You always also hear it in there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the phrase: mysterium tremendum et fascinans. That's Otto's phrase. And then he's like, so the fascinans is the one we talked about last time, this homing us against horror. But the
Mm-hmm.
tremendum is actually throwing us into horror.
Mm-hmm.
That's and now and then that's what this first part of this episode is about. This throwing us into.
Yeah. Okay. And that's kind of that the numinous is the mystery, and it can be broken out into fascinating or horror. That's that part you're talking
Yes.
about. So when it's
Yes.
fascinating, it's super salient.
Yes. And it compels us. It draws us. It's
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, just as an aside, this isn't really, but it reminds me of how like participating in ritual, which we'll get to, is making it super salient and drawing in. Like ritual does feel very magnetic. It feels like it's
yeah,
like you can't really help but do it,
yeah,
or things
mm,
start to come to you because you did it, and it feels
yeah,
very magnetic. So yeah, in that way, that's interesting. Okay, so then we move into horror films and just like trying to understand this word horror. So he's because words, words fail us. We convey more than we say. And when we're using these kinds of words that are in pop culture, we need to really get to the root of what they actually meant. And he's a
yeah,
big proponent of that. So he's going to really take this word
yeah,
horror apart. Also, we're not using terror because it's so associated now with terrorism that he's just like,
mm,
we're just going to leave that one to the side and we're going to use horror. And he's saying that horror movies are actually just surprising and startling these days, as opposed to actually
mm,
being like bringing about this feeling of horror. This ancestral fear of predation is actually what they're really
yeah. Hitting on.
emphasizing. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
a monster.
I also thought it was interesting. I have here written down the sense of contact with reality is changed. And then the primordial fear, what horror really is the primordial fear of becoming insane. And I thought it was so weird. We just talked about the fool.
Yep. Yeah. And then, yeah, not fear, madness or insanity.
Yeah,
That's what they're really
yeah,
stoking, is that
yeah,
that fear of going insane,
yeah,
being perceived as, I guess, insane. And I don't even know if it's really the perception that is what's so terrifying about being insane. It is actually that connection with the sacredness, that it's just in those moments it's horrifying. So it's not like, oh, people will see me as insane and that's horrifying. It's no, no, no. This interaction that I'm having right now is overwhelming, and yeah, completely discombobulating. These like
Mhm.
the most extreme rug pulls. Like we talk about rug pulls
Mhm.
pretty frequently. And now at this point, I think we've kind of like diluted that feeling too. But that's like one in the most extreme rug pulls you experience horror.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think before and after you might think of, oh, I don't want people to think of me as insane. But during, you're just you're just like trying
Anything.
desperately to grab onto
Yeah.
reality. It's like,
I would just like for people to exist right now. They can judge me all they want to.
yeah.
If they were real, that would be great. Yeah. So then this facing the monster, because he's talking about the work of Mary Douglas and says that these kinds of monsters, she's using this term intercategorical,
Mhm.
things that don't fall into an already existing category. I also appreciated him bringing back the word schema because that's
Mhm.
how developmentally in children we kind of build
Mhm.
schemas, and those can change a lot. But yeah, they kind of get to a point where it's like, that's a cat. And what she also mentions about this intercategorical kind of state is that it can be considered unclean and strange.
I'm weird and unclean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It challenges your grip on the world, on reality. That's, but especially the world. That's what I wrote down. And then he has like to explain why he has this little drawing of if it's here and it's here and it's there, or if it's here and here, it should be that, and if it's here and here, it should be that
Yeah.
type of thing. Like our minds really like structure,
Yeah.
and as soon as something doesn't quite fit the structure, it's like, what the fuck? It's
Yeah.
like,
And also in the myths, of course, in the myths, all I was thinking of was chimeras and centaurs and like these half man, half
yeah,
horse. With
yeah.
chimeras, it's a very weird, like that's a strange thing.
What is a
Um,
chimera?
so a chimera, actually, it's a biological term. That's where I learned it first. But chimera goes into the mythology too, and it's
Hmm.
usually like a three-part monster. It's like
Okay.
a
Oh, okay.
dragon, a goat, and something else that I can't remember. But it's just like all these.
A lion
I
head
think
is
you're right.
often,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that is.
The last book in the Bible, the Openbaring, Apocalypse, the John's Apocalypse, is that what it's called?
I think
Uh,
so, maybe.
the Openbaring, I don't know what it's, by
Okay.
Johannes, um, is full of these types of creatures.
Yeah.
That's where I know them from. And Daniel has visions, I
Done.
think, from these kinds of
Oh.
creatures, or the
So,
prophets.
and then of course, in our modern pop culture, we've got the Wolfman. He's saying that's a
Mhm.
merger between bestial and personal. So that's the intercategorical part of that. And then
Mm,
vampires I really liked. He did say like between living and dead, just like ghosts, but also
mm,
vampires consume and don't produce. And I
yeah.
think that's an interesting, archetypally rich way of describing what that means as vampire.
Mm.
And you've now also, well, because I'm sure they wrote this book after he did this
No,
series.
before. I think
Oh,
before.
the zombie
Because he
one?
referenced it. Or doesn't he not? No, does he not reference it? No, he does reference it.
He
He says
does.
him and Chris and Philip
Philip.
something, because Philip's my brother's name, so I remember the Philip part. And I know it's
Yeah.
spelled differently from my brother's Philip. It's back to zombies.
Back to zombies. Um, yeah, do you have any like anything you wanted to add to that? If like because that's the thing for vampires. I loved in our Dia Eros talk when you brought that up about, or was that a wheel talk maybe? I don't remember. But you were saying what is the fly in the idea of like dying, like because with zombies what breaks them down, what decomposes them is maggots and other things, and so you're like, so then what is the fly archetypally?
Mm.
And I didn't know if like maybe we could explore that a little more, or if there was anything that vampires brought up about zombies. When I say vampires consume but don't produce, then the archetype of the zombie, what would you say, like in a kind of succinct way?
Well, first, when John said vampires consume what they don't produce, I was like, I'm not sure that's really correct, because if a vampire bites you, you become a vampire as well.
Oh,
So,
good call. That's interesting. Yeah.
so they do,
Clone.
um,
I guess that would
yeah.
be something like cloning
Yeah,
yourself.
taking something that is, and which is actually all that human beings can do as well, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Okay, we can make babies, but that it is something that's, in our biology to do. And in that way they don't reproduce, as far as I know. Um, what exactly is the question?
Well, I'm kind of wondering what makes zombies have this intercategorical state other than living and dead, if there is anything. I mean, that might be it, but it feels like if vampires have a little more than just that distinction. And this could be something to contemplate over time for
Mhm,
me too,
mhm.
because
There is an episode, it's not linked to the Awakening Crisis anymore, but there's something that John and Chris talks about zombies, and then one of Symbol, um,
okay, I can
which
link
might be
those.
interesting for you to look at.
Yeah.
The thing is, vampires and zombies are so different.
Mm-hmm.
Vampires are sensual and
Yeah.
beautiful, and one would almost
Alluring.
consider becoming a vampire, but you would not want to be a zombie,
Mm-mm.
right?
Right. Yeah. So there's something in there about awareness for
Yeah,
sure. Like the vampire seems to be at least aware of
yeah,
its condition, where the zombie is just
brain
roaming
dead.
around, just a freaking pile of meat trying to
Yeah.
consume more and also turning the living into it, but
Hmm.
in this state where it's just like not aware. And
Yeah, both change you when they bite you. That's interesting.
yeah, that is interesting. And prevent you from dying or prevent you from
Yeah,
the ultimate death.
yeah.
And that's scary. Like, why is that something that we're like, well, I'll definitely, but other than with the vampire, because it's like, if I'm getting laid, I just got to go find some blood. Like thinking,
Yeah, it's definitely in both of them. It's our fascination with death
yeah,
and
which one?
immortality, death and immortality, and what exactly that means. And death is, of course, a real mysterium tremendum et fascinans.
Yeah, well, okay, so then let's talk about the kind of pop culture reference that he went with first, and then we'll get into how people are fascinated by death a little bit more when we talk about the
Okay.
accidents. So he's saying this whole concept of the intercategorial kind of puts us into the state of horror because intelligibility and realness are very connected. And this points to madness and losing a grip on reality, this horror. So he's giving you the example of a time when he was watching a film and experienced the state of horror, which was Kubrick's The Shining. And yeah, do you want to take us through his little synopsis?
First, I wrote down, "Don't drink your spit." And
That's oh, that was another thing he was talking about was how spit is disgusting when it's outside of you, but it comes from you. So that
yeah,
inter
and
category.
somehow when you're in the arms of your lover, spit is not that disgusting.
Nope. It's not.
Okay. Um, The Shining. I wrote, he seems to be going mad. So John 40 had it well in hand. But then the voices actually opened the door. And he was like, oh, I'm in a much different world that I thought I was in. And that's the words that's important. He got a chill because now he was participating in this character's madness. There were forces at work here that I did not understand. All of these are feelings that we know from rock pool moments, right?
Mm-hmm.
The spaces in our grip on reality through which things can slip. Those are the horrific.
Yeah, you put everything I put. There wasn't, he's like, there's nothing startling in that part of the film. It's just that, oh, now I'm also mad because that doesn't make sense. That doesn't fit the pattern that I was capturing in my psychology and cognitive science,
Mhm.
education, where I was like very much tuned to this guy being an alcoholic. And like, this was just a very good, way that I could objectively understand what was happening. And that's the thing is when you're objectively understanding things, you're seeing it from God's view or the bird's eye
Mhm.
perspective. But then when you get sucked into it and now it's no longer external to you, you are also experiencing that same feeling of insanity.
Mhm.
Then it's, yeah, horror.
Mhm. The words that you just used now, kind of, but this is jumping ahead,
Yeah. Okay.
relates to that whole how horror humbles you.
I was looking at that word humiliate right when you said that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because, you have a full, however many years he's been studying, a lifetime of experience in a particular field that would be,
S-
uh, yeah,
Further, a lifetime of being a highly intelligent
yeah,
human being.
right,
I've heard him talk with a bit of, a little hesitation. I heard him talk of what a gifted child he was. So he had a lifetime of probably getting the point before
mm-hmm,
everyone else
yeah,
and seeing through, reading between the lines before others could.
mm-hmm,
Most movies must be completely boring to him because he sees the beginning, sees the end in the beginning, or something like that. He had that lifetime of,
right,
getting a grip on things. And then he had this training, which he could now also name his grip on things.
right.
And
Oh,
then,
yeah. That's a really
mhm,
good distinction because he talks about trans frame breaking. So it's not even just the lenses through which he sees things, it's his whole operating system has failed him.
yeah,
Everything that built that, the objectability, the education and all of that was from an even, I don't know, a trans frame, like a completely different, I'm losing the words because we were looking through the lens. It's like what I was describing was, oh yeah, John sees all of this through his lenses of a psychologist and a cognitive
mhm,
scientist and all this. And you're like, no, like, but even further back than that, he was able to like, not even know, intuitively, he was
yeah,
able to use resources from before birth, maybe even, and
mhm,
and get to that place where he could see, and not just John, but I'm just describing it because that's how, he's
yeah,
presented it. So it's like, yeah, like my whole operating system that I built all of those structures on, it's just all collapsed. It's like that, the sand, and it's now
mhm,
flattened out into a
mhm.
base, but this is the process of falling on my ass down Falkland Hill. Yeah.
Oh, that's cute. Yeah, exactly. It's not just his training, in other words, that's like, um, um,
Called into
couldn't,
question. Yeah.
yes, it's his whole being, his way of being.
So that's one instance. And then he talks about, kind of what we were talking about, how people are just like all, and even in horror films, really, like the typical horror films, he was talking about how, like, it's just like people get slashed apart, and like, that's our primal fear of death.
Mm,
But we also have this fascination with death, as you've said in Latin. And he's talking about like accidents on the highway and what we call here rubberneckers, which people slowing down, you just want to catch a glimpse of what happened, and
mm,
there's a fascination in seeing like a wrangled up car and like
mm,
ambulance shuffling somebody to a, you know,
mm,
gurney and into the back of an ambulance, and fire trucks being there putting out a fire. Like, we're just like, so, because it puts us in confrontation with death, he says, completely severs our grip on reality, because what is death? It's like, well, we don't know.
mm,
And so, like, putting us so close in touch with it, we're fascinated by that.
mhm. I think it's more actually even it's our fatality, and then in the sense that John means fatality. Like,
Wait.
um, n- well, yes, we are bound to this. We live and then we die. We are creatures of flesh, and the flesh is so vulnerable. My experience when I look at gruesome physical, wounds and stuff, it's not so much that I see death, it's that I see my own frailty. Like, I can
Mm,
so easily be bruised, I can so easily be cut apart.
come on. Well, of
Cats have a
course.
sense for death. Oh, they're very
No
empathetic.
potato. Well, of course, my relationship with death is that I grew up as the daughter of a taxidermist, and that
Mm,
actually, like, seeing things kind of reconstructed in a way where they were no longer looking dead, it was almost like they were still alive, like their spirit was still there within that mount. And so I kind of felt probably that more things were alive than actually were alive. So when I went back to work for my dad and actually do taxidermy, that's when I noticed that you just said, like the frailty of my body and just having a lot of appreciation for these beautiful feathers and, you know, um all these systems of organs in the body and how they work together, but then all of a sudden they don't. They just shut off. And they're all
mm.
still there and they all still are physically, I can touch them, but whatever was there is no longer there.
And
My
animals know
confrontation.
it too.
Yeah.
My I had a dog. I got her when I was turned 21, or when I was 21, and my parents took her when I left South Africa, Pinocchio. And then they got another dog, which I still have, but she's getting very old. Um, and the new dog just loved the old dog, but the old dog, of course, tolerated the new dog as they usually do. But when Pinocchio died, they took her because Pinocchio was a house dog, and Mishka is a big dog, so she lives outside. She's got like a place to live outside. Um, and they took Pinocchio out to Mishka, who usually Mishka, when she saw Pinocchio, she would start licking her and go crazy of excitement. But they said Mishka just came, smelled her, looked at them like really like sad, and then walked away. So she immediately knew
She was going. Yeah.
she's gone.
Yeah. Yeah, that is something interesting about animals. I mean, they even have animals at hospice that will go to the next person and lay with them. They already know.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, yeah, our animals do seem to have that connection still with when it's coming.
Mhm. Well, my mom, when she worked in a hospital, there was the head nurse. I don't know what you call her, matrona. Um, she could smell death.
Yep.
She would tell my mom when she after she did her round, she'd tell her there's death in that room. He's gonna go today, and she was always right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is the interesting thing about being in such close relationship with death. I mean, if you
Mm,
see it every day, you're experiencing it on a frequent, basis, you get to know it.
mhm.
And that's an interesting entity to get to know. Yeah.
And you don't really know it, but like you don't ever really know anything.
No, exactly. But somehow it allows you to at least draw patterns and make predictions like that. So that's kind of where
Yeah,
you sense that you know.
you are participating with it in a way, at
Mhm.
least, where most of us don't participate with death.
Yeah, well, that takes me into my next line, which says, if the mystery becomes overwhelming to get an insight or understanding, it's like culture shock. All the machinery of coupling is trying to get what it can't, a relationship between two things we were talking about in the what is it?
Intercategorial,
Intercategory. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
intercategorial.
So all the machinery of coupling in those intercategorial states, because it could be one or the other, but the machinery of coupling is not able to compute because it's like,
Mm.
but it's not. And
Yeah.
there's no relationship. I got one more. It says, these are two things that horror kind of, he actually says the purpose of horror. I don't know if he meant it.
Mm.
Yeah. I don't know if he meant it that way, how we would take purpose. So we'll just leave that on the aside. But
Aristotle is taken up in Plotinus, so purpose, horror having a purpose could be.
okay, so he says horror, and he's kind of giving these 2 points. He's saying a demand to accommodate that pushes us to our limits and the realization that we are ultimately limited. So we're like getting pushed to our limit and then having that realization that we are ultimately limited. but we're like required to accommodate for that, you know,
Yeah.
that being pushed to our limits.
Yeah.
So that's that trans frame breaking we were talking about humbling and
Yeah,
humility.
humility. I've written here the demand to change who and what we are. And then I went on to humility. So horror, and I guess that's the purpose of what you mean, what the thing with the purpose of horror. It demands us to change. It demands us
Yeah.
to accommodate things that we don't necessarily want to accommodate.
Yeah. The numinous, therefore, puts us in contact with something greater and something that can threaten you.
Mm. I've got the words written on, I think it's his exact words. The realization, yeah, because he first said the sense, and he said, no, you have to be more specific. It's more stronger than just sense. It's the realization that we are indeed finally, ultimately limited. That no matter how much we grow, we
Mm.
can't grow enough to encompass the mysteries we are confronting. This trying to get what we can't get, which is a stable relationship. That stable was his exact words. And yeah, I know that very well.
Yeah. All right. He's got another diagram here.
So it's basically what we talked about now.
Mm.
Like last time, he spoke of how the sacredness can help us with our world attunement, homing us in despite horror, against horror, and then today we spoke of how it throws us into horror. So
Mm.
this is what the diagram
Okay.
points to, like homing us against horror, throwing us into horror. That's the two different. Ryan's words come back to me again, like a sound dissonance calls us to level up. And that is the opponent processing
Mm.
feeling I almost get. It's like it's feeling safe, but then not being safe, and then trying to, live with that. So you have to go to the next level to feel safe again.
Mm-hmm.
And then, oh, wait, there's more. And
Oh,
then
but wait.
next level
Yeah.
type of thing. And
Yeah.
yeah, something like that. So, like, relevance realization is just a fact of life. Like, we realize the fruit on the tree is relevant and hence we eat it, type of thing. But then this interacting with the sacredness,
Mm-hmm.
which is unseen, but dare I say it, real. Um, that's why it's a higher order. It's not just plain survival on this level of being.
Mm-mm. It's a meta meaning that affords us worldview attunement that homes us against horror.
And then I wrote down what I thought was really, it's about our connectedness to the world. Though I misspelled it and said the word, which is very relevant at this stage because I'm absolutely obsessed with the logos at this stage again. Our connectedness to the world, ourselves, and each other.
He says we are now invoking how we can use something symbolic to play with the machinery. I have written our culture, we have trivialized music from its connection to the sacredness. But I spelled connection CNXN. So I didn't catch that at first. But that's exactly what he said. Music from its connection to the sacredness. And therefore, if music can be connected to the sacredness, then that's how we connect to the sacredness.
Mm.
And then we go into signs and symbols. And I need for you to help me.
I have the symbol and the sign. You mean those two different
Yeah,
things, right?
exactly. Yeah. With the
Yeah.
heart for the sign. And
For me, a sign is something that points to.
oh, I was listening to I saw the sign and it opened up my eyes. I saw the sign.
A sign points to, and a symbol presence. I almost want to say
Mm-hmm.
what
Yeah,
it
he
is.
says refer slash exemplify. It gets you
Yeah.
to participate.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It like engages the mind in it.
Jung goes into signs and symbols quite a lot. So I feel like I really understand this, but I can't necessarily speak
Yeah.
it.
Okay.
But I do have a very deep, for me, it's very clear the difference
Yeah.
between signs and symbols.
Yeah.
And signs, I think, is something that helps you along the way, but you don't build a relationship with it. While a
Mm.
symbol you can actually build a relationship, participate with.
Mm.
Symbols are alive. Signs
Mm.
are dead. So signs are things that indicate things.
Yep. Yep. And
Like,
point
and that's
you.
why, yeah, when you see a sign, it's like it's pointing you in a direction.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, a symbol is something you can carry with you.
Yeah. And your
And
relationship with it. And it
yeah,
evokes feelings and
yeah,
like, yeah, like you're
yeah,
just that feels like an entity that you're in a relationship with as opposed to just something you see that puts you like a literal street sign or something like that.
yeah, yeah. Street signs is a good example of signs because it's literally exactly what
Yeah.
signs are supposed to be.
Okay.
Just
Yeah.
help you to read what you should do.
Yeah. Yeah. This
Yeah,
is the natural order.
yeah,
Go this way. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Well, that's, probably a distinction I'll probably continue to need to revisit, especially because my relationships with signs are such that they kind of come up very symbolically just in my work, my line of work. So, but he does kind of say about symbols, it's a metaphor that carries over or carries across two domains, look through to look at.
Yes,
So you're looking through it to look at something else when
yes.
you're using a symbol. That's very interesting. It's like from the frames I'm looking to
Yeah, and
look.
I think the icon goes with this as well.
Ah,
And that's when an icon can easily become an idol when you forget that it's something to look through.
I
And I
mean,
was
that's,
thinking,
yeah.
because I remember when I was talking of John and Chris as being my Socrates and Plato, which I don't need them anymore, yay, because I really love Socrates and Plato, the real Socrates and Plato. But I was thinking like, oh, maybe I'm getting this whole symbol thing wrong, but it's not. I really had to look through John
Yep.
to see Socrates in a different light so that I could learn to love Socrates.
Yeah.
Uh,
Let's get into Lakeoff, Johnson, and separately Barfield. I guess they all, beautiful.
Okay, so this is the book. It's from episode 2. It's first recommended. So we're going way back here when he talks about this book and their use of metaphors. Barfield is still to come. I do have him saving the appearances. I'm looking at him, but for some reason I don't have him with me. But he's still to come.
He starts going through all of these words, inter essay,
Hmm.
unterstand, which actually means in stand within.
Yes, that's
I,
beautiful, right?
yeah, I love that.
Stand within, interesse, to be amongst. Yeah. Well, that's just like the whole metaphor, like how we use because he talks about, do you see what I'm trying to say? Do you get my point? So it's this whole physical thing, something physical that we then used for for an abstract thing. For
Mm-hmm.
um, that's basically what that is about.
Okay.
And then this book goes on and on about how embodied experiences, he uses the word embodied experiences, are projected to the abstract or to the conceptual realm. And then he says, like, I don't really like this idea of projected, which he then also says, well, that's also actually a metaphor, projected. So, um, and then he says why.
Yeah, it points to a different way of understanding what a metaphor is doing besides projection.
Mhm. And then only later he actually uses the word acceptation,
Yeah.
but he uses it in episode 2. And so I immediately, when he said projection is too simplistic, I
Yeah.
thought, yeah, but acceptation then, right? So
Yes, you remembered. Good callback.
yeah, it only took me 3 times to go
Yeah,
through this, and now I.
it gives me hope. Okay. Symbols tap into deeper metaphors. So that's kind of where we're coming all together full circle. We were just talking about symbols. And that's so he's like, it's not just a projection.
Mhm.
It's going back into that symbol, tapping
Yeah,
into a deeper metaphor.
profound metaphors. He uses the words, it's a bottom up emergence and a top down emanation, which is really important. The words emergence and emanations for his new Platonic worldview.
Okay.
So symbols are very much a way by which we participate in the levels of reality, would then be something I could deduce from these words that he used, I think. Yeah, profound metaphors to hold in mind. And that's when I wrote a sigil, because a sigil is also to hold in mind. It's also to
Mm-hmm.
hold it. That's at least how I use sigils, to
Mm-hmm.
hold something in mind. I mean, I know it can also be used magically, but I don't know if I've ever used it magically on purpose.
Because well, we're going to just recall that the
Mm.
tongue was exapted for speech, though it was used and it was
Mhm.
evolved for other purposes. But we, the side effects became the central effects, and we started to use it to speak. And so he talks about that book After Phrenology here.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. I'm so drowning in Plato at the moment, very willingly.
Yeah.
And this is a book that's it's not that thick, but it's, well, the subtitle is Neural Reuse and the Interactive Brain. So I think it's gonna be a bit challenging.
Mm-hmm.
So I will definitely read it. It's
Yeah.
just not the time.
Okay. Um, I think we kind of get exaptation though, so that's
Yeah.
really what he was emphasizing here with that anyway. Um, he mentions the cerebellum. I always
Yes.
wanted to marry a man with the last name Bellum, but anyway, he's talking about the cerebellum and how it's centrally involved with balance. But then we there was an the exaptation of that function, I guess, of that mode. And so now, he's saying the cerebellum is not just involved in balance, but it also allows us to have visual imagery and other things that
Picking up patterns and coordinating between keeping balance in, like, in concepts type of thing. Um, I'm very hazy on this because I haven't read the book, but that's what I got, that like that's now also an exapted function of the cerebellum.
yeah.
It's
So
also help us to actually keep balance, uh, and I think maybe even emotionally, but intellectually, he says.
yeah, and he says balance to be a just person. So he's relating justice with balance there. It's like you have to have that balance in order to be a just person. I don't know if he's making a like hard argument with that. So,
He won't, because claiming that he knows what justice is very unplatonic.
mm-hmm. Mm,
And when my mind went, like, it wasn't that I was questioning you, I was
yeah.
trying to think what, because the politeia, which we generally translate as the republic, is all about justice. But I'm thinking the balance thing, Plato actually uh, says belongs to temperance, which one, because remember the card that is temperance is justice in the
Mm-hmm.
other tarot. So that's justice for the politeia in Plato is not necessarily keeping balance. It's it's that to each his own. Let everyone play his part.
Mm, let me
That
play the fool. Yeah, that took me back to that very first thing before a moral view of the sacredness, there was a pre-moral view of the sacredness.
yeah,
And it feels like that is kind of something that applies maybe to justice in that way too.
yeah,
Like justice can mean something moral, but
yeah,
even before that, it was like of that picture not doing a mountain justice.
yeah.
It's not a moral question, it's just a
doesn't come to its right.
It's pre-moral. It's a
Yeah.
pre-moral view
But
of
that's very platonic. It doesn't come to its right. It doesn't let it be fully what it is,
right. Yeah.
which is injustice, indeed. What John is saying here, I think, is like, let's focus on the symbol of the scales.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
when you look on that at that symbol, then justice is balancing.
Yeah.
That is all he's saying. He's not
Yeah.
claiming that justice is balancing.
Okay.
It's just through this symbol,
Yeah.
justice is balancing.
Right. I would make the same just based on, like I said, Venus and Libra.
Mm,
Or,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
It is interesting, too, to emphasize that she's blindfolded.
yeah.
That's interesting.
But then it's that you feel it in your hands, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's actually
Embodied.
a pretty cool ritual, putting two different things in someone's hands and let them choose
Balancing.
based on weight.
Yeah.
And I don't know, but it's, yeah.
That's
We should do
interesting.
that
I
sometime,
like that.
blindfold each
Yeah.
other, but not all at once.
He's got, well, I did this. Justice points to balance, points to activation of machinery. What am I saying there?
The arrowed activation of the cognitive machinery.
Cognitive. Okay, interesting.
Yeah. I got a little, I only have one sentence left, and I wrote what I can do with a symbol. And then I wasn't sure if it's just the specific symbol or all symbols. Retrace, activate the cognitive machinery. So it's not just projection. It's very much, it's what's really important here, I think, for this to understand with the symbol, it's that's what is important for John in everything. It's the same as that not subjective, not objective, but transjective thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just projected up. Symbol also allows, no, invites
Mm,
this attachment, this seeing through towards something.
mm-hmm.
So it's a two-way relationship
Yeah.
almost with that. I think that he's explaining here.
Yeah, that's interesting because then it's like, you know how people will say that the muse led them to create the music or the muse led them to create the art. And then in every engagement with that art or that music, we're engaging with the sacredness that they
Mhm.
were
Touched by.
touched by, invited by. With a symbol, I can look at the machinery of balance to get the optimal grip on another domain. Symbol is participatory, participating with balance and being just.
Mm. Yeah. So it sounds like he's specifically still talking about the woman with the scales here.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take that out, can you read the sentence again,
Mm-hmm.
please?
With a symbol, I can look at the machinery of balance to get an optimal grip on another domain.
Yeah. So you look at the machinery to get an optimal grip. That's what you do with the symbol. And then what's the next
Um,
part?
the symbol is participatory,
Yeah.
participating with balance, being just.
So yeah, the symbol is participatory. It helps you to participate with that which is beyond the symbol, which is
Mm-hmm.
exactly what John was for me, for Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
It helped me to
Mm-hmm.
participate with Socrates in a positive way.
Yeah.
Because I now with this course with Johannes I'm taking, it was voiced again in the beginning. Some other people are reading Plato for the first time, and they're like, "This Socrates is an asshole," and
Every time.
and I'm like, "Yeah, but you should look at him through John."
Yeah. Yeah.
Through, and not a big lens, but a John lens. Like,
Yeah.
and then you will see him differently, and you
Mm-hmm.
will, see his why he's asking
Why?
the
Yeah.
questions, and why he's, being the way he is. He's a kind man, and he's genuinely searching for the truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that he's a stingray or a gadfly for the purpose of being a stingray or a
Mm-hmm.
gadfly.
Okay, well, do you have something to take us out with then? We don't.
So I am in for a treat as well, I hope. I wrote here in the beginning, read with Sarah, and then there's a lot of passages on astrology, which I'm not going to read. Then there's one horror. which I am going to read, but I cannot for the life of me remember what it says. So here we go, page 594. And I didn't want to look before, I wanted to be surprised with you. So, do not try to see with mortal eyes, as our account says, nor try to see it as would someone who supposed that all things are sensible. By supposing that, one would eliminate what exists most of all. For those things which someone thinks to exist most of all do not exist. And that which someone thinks has great existence has less of it. That which is first is the principle of existence, and even more properly first than substantiality. So you should reverse your belief. If you don't, you will be left alone, bereft of God, like those at festivals stuffing themselves with food, something that is not licit for those approaching the gods to do, believing that the food is more substantial than the sight of the God whom they should be celebrating, and not partaking of the rites within. For in these rites, the God who is not seen produces disbelief in those who only believe in things they can see clearly, which they only see with their flesh. It is as if there were people who slept throughout their lives and believed that their dreams were trustworthy and clear. If someone were to waken them, they would disbelieve what they saw with their own eyes, and they would go back to sleep.